third season of VoyJourn.
The purpose of all this is to gain knowledge of the universe and the people in it.
You two are turning into a Star Trek script.
Yes, it is a little bit clunky. Hopefully it will pay off in the long run.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to the third season of Voyager, episode number 11. The title of this episode is called Q and the Grey, but I think we're calling it 50 Shades of Q today. We get a on-screen sex scene in this episode with no editing or deletion at all. So that's an exciting and steamy thing we'll get to see. But let's hear the synopsis.
Well, I'm not sure about the exciting and steamy, but anyway. In this episode of Voyager, we have Q turn up again, and he wants to woo Captain Janeway in order to mate and produce offspring. Janeway doesn't buy it, but the matter indeed is more serious than Q lets on. The death of the other Q, that is Quinn, in their previous encounter has thrown the Q continuum off balance. Civil war has broken out, with the struggle adversely affecting the galaxy. Q's side is losing, but a child, to Q's way of thinking, may restore that balance, and mating with Janeway might be an infusion of new blood that the continuum needs. And then there's the complication of another woman, Q's mate, to consider.
I had a lot of fun with this episode, and it actually brought back a lot of memories because I was in Japan during my primary school years and was educated at an American run school, and so in the library there were many stories about the American Civil War that I used to read, and this particular episode, The Q and the Grey, is a play on a mini-series that came out about a decade before called The Blue and the Grey, and refers to the uniform colours of the two sides in the Civil War. So it was a lot of fun seeing that particular part of history recreated in an amusing way in this episode. And I also enjoyed the fact that there was a lot of interesting stuff for me to reflect on in terms of the incarnation and Mary's motherhood of Christ. So I'm looking forward to getting into that today.
So not 50 Shades of Q at all then. The grey in this is an entirely different uniform.
So it would
Yes.
seem. I did find this an odd episode, I have to say. I quite like Q, and I like the actor that plays him and the character of Q, but just turning up with like red heart-shaped pillows and satin sheets and trying to seduce the captain, I mean, it did boggle my mind somewhat.
If you know Q from other Star Trek properties, you know that's his character, though. You know, there's a famous scene where he turns up on the bridge of the Enterprise with Picard with a mariachi marching band, you know, to celebrate something or other. He's just always does these wacky, over-the-top things, you know, whether it's for good or ill.
Yeah.
I was also fascinated by the way that it would be very easy in this episode to take the sexual advances of Q and actually put them into a particular gendered perspective. But as I went back through other episodes of Next Generation and even in Deep Space Nine, where Q meets other figures, I saw that his treatment of all of those were actually utterly consistent. He ends up flirting with Picard whilst they're lying in bed together. He whispers into the ear in an uncomfortably intimate way to Commander Sisko and to Julian Bashir, and so he is consistently boundaryless with his levels of intimacy and connection with every single crew member that he comes in contact with.
Maybe that goes with his omnipotence or whatever it is. Anyway, the fact they live forever. Maybe you can keep breaking boundaries if there's nothing to actually stop you doing that. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, and I think the omnipotence, you know, means that there's little consequence. You know, I mean, for us, you know, if you cross boundaries, there can be consequences from, you know, a cold shoulder to a slap to a jail sentence. You know, so That's different if you're able to do anything without the fear of any consequence.
I wonder also whether or not there's something about power that's actually taking place in terms of boundaries too. The more power an individual has, the less boundaries they need to be, well, probably the more boundaries they need to be aware of, but the less boundaries they become aware of. So boundaries are in some senses more urgently important for the powerless, but they can become, I guess, less important for the powerful, which is actually part of the danger of power.
I think that's right, and I think Q's a really good example of that. And he demonstrates that time and time and time again that he's just not thinking of it. And even if it's pointed out to him that what he's doing is inappropriate, he doesn't get it.
Yeah, it's reminds me of a podcast I was listening to just yesterday, which was discussing things that had happened at Christianity Today magazine, where a couple of key figures had been outed as having inappropriate behaviour to women and so forth, and one in particular was the managing editor. So, the power imbalance was not just about, it was interesting because it wasn't just about the relationships of that editor with the women that he did inappropriate advances to, but it was also the way that power permeated the system, so that when the women would complain to HR, they would, get told, oh, look, you don't want to make too much of it, nothing really happens, so why don't we just keep it on the quiet, it won't be good for your career if you make and so that power actually warped the whole system, to enable his boundary crossing behaviour to continue.
That's a really good point you're making, Lindsay. And I know at the moment, Crikey is doing a whole expose on Hillsong. And a lot of what happens in that church is the same thing, where time after time, male offenders are shown grace, whatever that is, and women who are the victims are shown the door. Pretty much, that's what's been happening. And I think it does permeate.
Yeah. I've been listening to another podcast called Total Mutuality, which also covers this kind of, religious power space, and talks about even the subtle aspects of the way that power and boundaries are put in place. So speakers given a celebrity status, they get a green room. In the green room are all of these special things that only certain people have passes to be able to go into certain places. And so without it being implicitly stated, there is this sense that people in positions of power are entitled to privileges that others are not, and so that kind of framework then sets up a question of even being able to dispute someone who's actually in that position of privilege.
And it's interesting because that whole idea of power came to me very early on in the episode, where Q fronts Catherine Janeway in her quarters, and sort of the ultimate bit of that scene is him saying to her, I've chosen you to be the mother of my child.
Yep.
And of course, immediately it raised the spectre for me of Mary being chosen and told by an angel that she'd been chosen to be the mother of the Son of God. And as I was thinking about this, and perhaps, because I'd been listening to this stuff about power imbalance and whatever, it occurred to me, okay, the way we frame this is that Mary accepted, gracefully and graciously, but the God of the universe says, I want you to bear my child. Given the power imbalance, is she actually able to give consent?
I have wondered that before, Lindsay, and usually gotten howled down, because that really is raising some sort of sacred cow, I think.
Yeah.
And I would not like to actually compare the Archangel Gabriel with our friend Q. I would hesitate to do that. I don't think Gabriel would magic up a red velvet bed with satin and etc. But I think it's a good question, because I've asked that before. Could Mary really, given what's going on, had the power to say no? Because that's immense pressure. When an angel turns up in the Bible, firstly, they say, do not be afraid. So they're obviously quite intimidating or inspiring creatures. And secondly, I don't know that we've got any example in the Bible where someone said no once that
Yep.
angel turns up, or a burning bush or God or whatever it is. It seems from that point you have somehow committed, even if you have doubts, they're always talked away.
And it's interesting, even in this episode, we see Q saying to Janeway, tell me that you're not even the slightest bit tempted by the opportunity to be able to explore new dimensions, to go, and Janeway says very clearly, actually, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't tempted to do this. So the power imbalance is there. On the other hand, though, we might question Q's use of power quite a bit over time, and rightly so. I found it fascinating that consent was still very important to him in this episode. That not only did he, certainly he attempted to make a convincing argument, but he was prepared to actually go and gain wise counsel from Tom Paris and Harry Kim and Neelix about what kinds of things they should do.
Wise counsel from Tom Paris about women.
Well, having been the only person who in the show who's actually had an intimate relationship with the captain thus far, I mean, I guess he's a subject matter expert on the process.
No, we're not going back to the catfish.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about this power question is that it actually says in some relationships it's actually not possible to give consent. So it's not just about exercising your power and overpowering the other person. It's actually saying this is not an appropriate relationship to have. And I mean, I think we recognize that, for instance, in therapeutic relationships, where we say, regardless of anything, it's just not an appropriate relationship. If you want to have that relationship, you quit that therapeutic relationship, you spend some time out enabling people to recenter, and then you can, see whether you want to explore something. And that's really interesting to me, because I think, perhaps as a male and whatever, you always think all I've got to do is just be sensitive enough and allow the other person to make a choice. But what this is saying is that sometimes they just can't make a free choice because of the difference in power in the relationship.
I think that's a really good.
Does that have
insight.
anything to do with the size of the tattoo the person has? I mean,
that was one of my quotes that I liked, when he says, "Is this big enough?" and she says, "Not big enough." I thought there was a bit of play going on there. He said, "Mine's bigger, not big enough," says Janeway.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. Well, look, I'm really fascinated to jump into this Marian Annunciation. There's some lines in this that really beg us to go in there. What happens when a Q, in this case, and in many cases in Star Trek, portrayed as godlike, and in fact, even in the episode Tapestry, when Q appears to Picard, he places himself in the position of God of the afterlife, and actually gives Picard an opportunity to revisit his existence. What happens when God wants to make the mother of peace? I mean, this is a fascinating statement of reconciliation about omnipotent beings and mortal creatures that really does take us into that whole Mary question.
Well, it does. And the other time in the episode when it raised it for me was later, when Janeway and Q are in the Union encampment or whatever, and they're talking, and she says, regardless of any of either the good that might happen or my temptation to go and explore strange new worlds, that I won't do it because I don't love you. And love is the foundation of family. We can't have a child if we don't have love. And so again, that sort of made me think about Mary and, okay, in what sense does Mary love God, and is it the same kind of love as you would have for a human partner that you're procreating with, and how does that feed into what this family will become? And of course, traditionally we have this idea of Joseph sort of stepping into the role of a parent of Jesus and providing that sort of family. But, according to the story, Joseph is not Jesus' father. So, yeah, that was another one that raised that whole idea for me.
It's also going back a step further, Lindsay, in the biblical narrative here in Luke and looking at Elizabeth, Mary's cousin. She doesn't get a choice at all. An angel appears to Zechariah, and again it says he was terrified, fear overwhelmed him. The angel says, "Do not be afraid." And it says, "Your wife Elizabeth will bear a son, and you will name him John." There's no choice evident here. This is going to happen, and this is what you're going to call this child.
It doesn't make our tradition look good. I mean, the reality is we've got this imposition on Elizabeth, and then God appears to be a bit like a deadbeat dad who actually turns up and does the deed, and then isn't there again until much later on, till Jesus is a grown person in the garden saying, "Father, Father." Like it kind of. It's almost it doesn't paint God in a good picture in terms of being a nurturing parent to understand it in this scenario.
And I guess just to play the flip side though, I found some of the stuff in here quite inspiring in a way, and it's interesting that I hadn't I think remembered this, but watching the episode again, they are very clearly drawing on these parallels. It's not a mistake, or us from a Christian perspective saying, "Oh, we recognise this in this." They are clearly doing that, and there's this line where Q talks about the need for a new Messiah, and the line after that, which is one of my quotes of the week, is, "Our child will be like a precious stone tossed into the cosmic lake, sending endless ripples of human conscience and compassion to wash up on every distant shore of the universe." And I loved that. I thought that was such a poetic sort of description of what we as Christians would see in Jesus as this beginning of a process of endless rippling of conscience and compassion that in our belief system actually touches every part of the universe. So I thought that was quite poetic.
Yeah, except I'm not sold on that, Lindsay, because it sounds like human-centric arrogance to suggest that our stone is the important stone that will actually make the Q continuum better. Like, I'm looking at the world at the moment and I'm thinking about the way in which we're managing politics and power and corruption. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, look, if I were the Q continuum, I might be looking for a different species to actually make that shift. If he's got the option to choose anyone, why choose us?
Well, he seems to fancy Janeway a bit and her personality as being intelligent and, resourceful and having a lot of qualities that he admires. But I'd probably be looking at something like the Ocampans. I think they've got a lot more to offer in terms of kindness and compassion and other things like that than the human species has. And I look at our world today and I think whatever ripples we thought Jesus' death sent out, it's not working.
Yeah, look, I mean, I get that perspective, Elizabeth, but I think I'm more sanguine about this. I think, I was it a scholar named Pinker who wrote a recent book about probably 6 or 7 years ago, looking at violence in the world and the changes in that, and showing from a statistical point of view quite clearly that the world is far less violent, even with the wars of the 20th century, than was the case in the past. But I think for me, like part of what Star Trek does is explore the good of humanity. I mean, that it's part of the
It
underlying
is utopian.
philosophy,
Yeah.
that Roddenberry started with, is to explore what humanity can be at its best, which in the classical Christian tradition is what we believe Jesus represents, is humanity at its best. So when we talk about the ripples of human compassion and conscience, we're not talking about humans that we see around us, and absolutely there's a lack of compassion and conscience going on in many parts of our world. We're talking about what humanity could be at its ultimate.
But it's not
I think
there
it still
yet.
raises the question for me. Yeah, it still raises the question for me too about salvation, and the process God uses to reconcile with humanity. If we are not alone in the universe and we do discover that there are other alien races, um, does God need reconciliation with those beings as well, or did they make better decisions in relation to their relationship with God and each other, so that reconciliation was not required? Or if reconciliation was required, does the coming of Christ on earth reconcile the other creatures as well? And what is it about our existence on the western spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy that actually makes us the special place? It's that whole Andrew Lloyd Webber Judas question: why in first century Judea on Earth in the Milky Way galaxy does all of this divine reconciliation take place?
And I think actually this episode, for me, casts some sort of light on that, because I mean, one of the fascinating things from a science fiction point of view is this idea that Q can create a scene in the Civil War where it allows Janeway, the mortal, the human, to have some understanding of what is going on, but she's not actually seeing reality. She's seeing an analogy.
Yeah.
And I mean,
parable.
A parable,
Yeah.
yeah. And I then found that really difficult to think, okay, so what is she actually doing when she tends his wounds? Is she
Exactly.
actually doing some weird interdimensional thing, or what, and how does she know how to do that? But that idea of an extended analogy, I think for me, plays into then the questions that we're asking about, what does it mean to say that God is in Christ, and what does it mean to say that that has a cosmic impact? And for me, one of the ways that I would grapple with this is that it's around. It is a parable, and it's a parable, I think, the way sometimes the classical Christian tradition has framed reconciliation with God is misleading. And actually, it's a parable which shows us that God is on our side. So the reconciliation is not because God's mad at us and we have to, sacrifice the right number of goats or one son of God in order to get back on God's good side. The parable is that God's always been on our side, but we haven't recognized that, and we have walled ourselves off from that truth. And so I can imagine that if you're thinking about, aliens or something from another arm of the galaxy or another galaxy or whatever, they need a different parable. And it doesn't change the underlying truth, which is that God is on the side of creation. But the parable might need to be different in a different setting.
Well, that makes sense, because the rabbis themselves always are retelling the stories from their scriptures and traditions to suit their current context and their current culture and what people need to know or hear or to ponder. So that would make perfect sense. Though it doesn't actually address one of the things for me, which has always been a question. If you are right, Lindsay, about, it's about removing walls, etc., why does there need to be a sacrifice at all?
Yep.
Well, and I guess my quick answer to this, and hey, we could spend hours talking about it, but my quick answer is that motif of sacrifice was something that made sense to the people growing out of their religious way of thinking.
Yep.
But I mean, the idea of sacrificing in order to appease the gods, it comes up in lots of different human religions.
Yes.
And so I think it was building on that to say, okay, well, let's think about sacrifice, but let's think about it in a different way. This is not actually about you appeasing the gods. It's actually about God doing it, what is required.
Absolutely. And maybe that atonement theology says more about us and what we think we need than what God needs in order to be able to make that restoration. I'm also struck by the idea, as we've been talking, that we don't have to go to other planets to actually understand this. This has massive multi-faith implications for us. That the reality is, maybe my ancestors needed the sacrifice, but when I immerse myself in Aboriginal Dreamtime stories of our First Nations people here in Australia, they have a very different way of actually creating a parable or a place to be able to discuss their relationship with the universe and the spirits and creation and the like. And so in many ways, a great disservice has been done by imposing one form of reconciliation or relating to God over all other forms of understanding. And so our planet has actually kind of lost the diversity of the ways in which this reconciliation might be possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Will, because Christianity marched in assuming it had the truth, and it just smothered a lot of those other stories and a lot of and all those other ways that people saw they'd been reconciled with the divine, whatever form that divine took in that religion. And by colonizing and by imposing that, I think we did lose a lot of diversity.
And I remember quite some years ago listening to a lady speak, and I think she was from the United Church of Canada, but I might be wrong on that, but that was my recollection. But she was certainly from a church that had a uniting sort of background. And she was talking about the change in paradigms for those kinds of uniting type churches, and how the original impetus had been very much framed around seeing the diversity of different religious traditions as a result of sin and error. And so we have to bring people back together in order to restore the brokenness that has come through sin. And she was giving an alternative paradigm, which is, well, what if you think about it as it's not that you have to bring together into one something that was broken, but that you actually need to bring together the different facets which all enable, which are all different, and enable us to see the beauty of God, like the facets on a diamond. You need them all pointing in different directions to give the beauty of the diamond. And I really love that idea that, in our quest to be uniting as part of the Uniting Church in Australia, it's not about making everyone the same to restore some previous perfection. It's actually about enabling all the diversity to come together in its diversity in order to show us the beauty of God.
That's a really nice image I think you're presenting there, Lindsay, with all the facets of the diamond that allow it to reflect the light and give it its actual beauty and, make it a desirable object, if you like. Because it's much more desirable cut like a diamond than it is if it's sitting in a lump of rock, as it were, looking monolithic.
I felt that acutely too. A couple of years ago, before COVID, I had the chance to go across to England, where my ancestors come from, and I went to Tintagel, and I went to some of the ancient villages that were still on the Isles of Scilly and around Penzance. And I had to wonder what the religion and spirituality of these people would have been like before the Romanization. And even last night at our board games group, we were playing the GMT game Pendragon, which is actually all about the way in which the Romanization of that area copied over or obliterated the spirituality of the islands of Britain, in the same way that it has done in the islands of the Pacific and other places as well. So we have lost more than we know because of this dominant narrative that actually talks about atonement sacrifice.
I don't think that's quite true about the Romans. The Romans always respected local gods, and they allowed local peoples to practice their religions as they found them. What they did do, though, was combine them with something of their own god. So if they found a water god in part of Britain living in a river, they would find a similar water god in their own tradition. So, and it would often have dual names. So if the British water god was Fred and the Roman water god was Felix, you'd have the god Fred Felix.
Although by 500 AD, when the Pendragon era is coming in, you've actually got a very different mandate by the Roman Empire than in the earlier periods. So,
well, I was thinking earlier when they first got to Britain rather than the later period. But you're right. Once imperialism really took hold, that's when the rot sets in.
That's it.
Once Christianity becomes the religion of
the empire,
right?
That's it.
It's Christianity that's the rot, not imperialism.
Well, it's both.
Maybe it's a combo. Yeah,
it is, because imperialism allows Christianity to take a certain form and be deployed, if you like, almost as a weapon in a certain way.
I think that's a good segue for us as we're moving into this kind of blue and grey area that this episode is all about, the Q and the grey. Is that civil war was a battle between the freedom of the individual and I guess the power of the state, and so there is that theme comes up in this, where Q says that after the death of Quinn, that there was the reality was known that the Q had the right to choose what they wanted to do, and so Q himself sounds the horn of freedom, as in his words. So the blue in this case is wanting to say, well, actually we have the right, the freedom to make our own choices about life and death and procreation and freedom. Whereas the grey Q are actually wanting to say, no, we're a confederacy of that actually maintains an existence and a position of control. And so there was some fascinating stuff in relation to freedom and control in this episode.
And I think the when you delve into the history of that, the fascinating thing is that the Confederacy, the Southern bloc. And you see this reflected now in ultra right-wing sort of groups, see themselves as the freedom party,
the freedom fighters. Yeah,
they do.
Whereas the Union is the power of the state telling you how you must believe, and so that's fascinating. Then when you then think about it in terms of the slavery issue, because of course the freedom for the Southern bloc was only freedom for the land-holding gentry to act as they wished, which included enslaving other people. It wasn't freedom for the slaves, which of course was what the Union was on about, was freedom not just for some but for all, and the power of the state to actually enact freedom for all in a society that was otherwise not just. So it's a fascinating in and out, and this idea of freedom or independent thinking, which is now picked up by anti-vaxxers and whatever. Inevitably is my freedom, even if it costs other people their freedoms.
Well, that's right. And it's a very individualistic thing. It's my rights, my sovereign rights. And, if that impinges on you and I give you some foul disease because I won't wear a mask because of my rights not to wear it, do these people in Australia particularly, do they get on in their cars and put a seatbelt on? I mean, there seems to me a lot of inconsistency in this thinking and how they operate.
Well, I know some of these people in Australia, and when they do put their seatbelts on, they can't help but actually tell you that they're only doing it out of fear of punishment from the state that's oppressing them. So they might actually be doing it, but they're actually so everything is couched in this idea that anything that directs me to behave in a certain way is a form of oppression or a reduction of my rights,
But they
without.
still do it.
Yeah, well, because of the fear of the consequence is actually greater. They could become unlicensed. They could lose the ability to drive a car altogether. It's an interesting dynamic here, talking about, even in this case, whether or not we actually obey the law of the land because we're afraid of the punishment or consequence that will come, or whether we obey it because we believe in the freedoms that it actually provides for all people.
Well, I
And
guess it's
I
a
mean, I
mix.
think that particular example you give of seatbelt wearing is one where, personally, I think it does fall much more in the camp of take responsibility for yourself. Because if I drive around without a seatbelt, it's very unlikely that as a result of that I'm going to kill someone else. I'm going to kill myself.
Exactly.
It's more to do with registration and making sure your vehicle is roadworthy. Because if you drive a non-roadworthy vehicle, you're likely to kill not just yourself but other people in some kind of crash or something. So, and I don't know what I'm saying, but it's always that balance, isn't it?
But Lindsay, even if the only person you're going to harm or kill is yourself, that still has a ripple effect. So if I were to be driving a car and I'm wearing my seatbelt and we have a collision with another vehicle and that person isn't, and that person dies as a result of not being there, that has a traumatic effect on me as the driver of the other vehicle, that I've now been involved in a situation where someone has died. So I think, even when we make decisions like about issues like self-harm, for example, you might want to say, okay, well, look, self-harm only hurts the person who's actually doing it, but that's not true.
No, it's not.
Self-harm actually hurts everyone who encounters it, and so there are, regardless of how much we might try to mitigate it, there are repercussions for other people for all of the actions that human beings choose to take.
I guess it's just whether you accept those repercussions as being your responsibility or the responsibility of others to manage them, even if you've created them.
That's right.
And I guess that's the difference between our anti-vaxxing, anti-whatever they are people, and the rest of us.
Yep. And let's not forget that this whole process begins out of the freedom of one Q to choose death. So it was just his choice. It seemingly would only have an impact on his existence alone, and yet what we're seeing here is that actually has caused a disruption across the Q continuum that now makes supernovas a common event.
Yes, so I think it was pretty clear actually when he did it, it was going to have consequences. I think our current Q made that very clear at the time.
Yep.
So one of the things that I think the Civil War setting leads to is a question which Q actually puts in another quote, which I've noted as a quote of the week, which is, war can be an engine of change. War can transform a society for the better. And I thought it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about that one, which obviously, drawing on the Civil War setting, his argument is, without the Civil War, there wouldn't have been this change for the better in society of freeing slaves. But Janeway puts the counter view, which is that surely, the Q should have evolved to a point where you can find a non-violent way to resolve conflict. So I thought I'd be interested in your thoughts. Can war be an engine of change and transform society for the better? Or, do those who live by the sword die by the sword, to quote some fellow from a while back?
Well, I think it can be both. I think it can be the chaos and violence that does cause society to evolve. I don't think you can have a war and not change society. It will be changed. The people who were involved will be changed. The people who are victims will be changed. It just depends on where that change goes. I mean, when you talk about the Civil War in America, I assume that most slaves would be fairly grateful for it if it got them freed. So
Yep.
in that case, there was an evolution of some kind that was to the good. With the Great War and the Second World War, I think that's much more murky if
But
you're
also,
looking at what evolved.
some might suggest that the slavery that was gained by African Americans was, sorry, the freedom that was gained by African Americans was actually just another form of slavery, and that many today still feel the oppression of slavery, even though the war was won on their behalf.
That's probably true, but they're not being beaten and
No.
chained up and forced to walk in a plantation. So there's something that's altered that's clearly for the good,
Yeah.
even if it has negative things that are ongoing, because there
Even
are
if it
people in
hasn't gone far
America.
enough.
It hasn't gone
Yeah,
far enough. Yeah.
that's exactly right. And people in America will still say black people are inferior to them. And I don't get how they're doing that, but apparently they are. So, that didn't work.
Entrenched culture. I
Something
just
like
wanted
that.
to pick up on the live by the sword, die by the sword. A remarkable irony that occurs to me is that Jesus was a carpenter and died by being nailed to a piece of wood. So I
Yes.
guess that pans out that our profession is probably the thing that might end up causing our eventual death. So
I don't know how ministry is going to cause my death, Will. I'm interested
You'll
to hear what
die
you
of
think about that.
mid someone's sermon,
That's right.
Elizabeth.
That's fantastic. I was very keen also to explore one of the major goofs in this episode. Q tells Janeway that Qs have never mated before and that they don't know how to do it. But that seems to completely disregard the existence of one Amanda Rogers, who appears in an episode of Next Generation called True Q, where she is the offspring of 2Q, and the Q have been kicked out of the continuum, and the parents have died. She becomes an orphan, and so Q comes to assess whether or not Amanda Rogers should be allowed entry into the Q continuum as an offspring who has grown up outside the continuum, or whether or not she should be deleted from existence in the universe. So they've made a bit of a continuity error there in the fact that Qs have mated in the past, that offspring has been produced. So I thought that was a fascinating kind of continuity problem that they had.
Well, I thought it was an issue simply because he and his female Q knew exactly what to do with your unabashed sex scene, where they go ding with their fingers,
Yes.
and this offspring is miraculously produced. So where's
Yes.
the foreplay for centuries and the other crap he's gone on about?
It's very efficient, though. Very efficient.
It is efficient.
Yes. What I loved about that particular scene is that the captain watched. Like,
Yes.
like she's coming up behind going, oh, yes, I'd like to see, talk about VoyJourn.
I'm not sure it was like that at all.
She was curious as to how it would be done, I guess. It was a David Attenborough. And here we see 2Q in the midst of mating.
Yes.
I mean, the thing then after that, when Q turns up in the captain's ready room with the offspring, does he give the child a name? I can't remember.
Q.
I don't think so.
Yeah, then the child's name is Q. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that's right.
Yeah.
Yep. But Janeway is quite smitten by this little Q, and it's interesting that there's something about the character of Q that people find it hard to stay mad at Q.
Yeah.
Even after all the things that he's done. And I wonder if that's part of his omnipotence, is that he warps people so that they will have a good regard for him. It reminded me of earlier in the show where he's, on the holodeck with Kim and Paris and whatever, that people treat him with a lack of respect that made me think, would you really treat an omnipotent being? Like, would you really treat God the way people treat Q? There seems to be this built-in sense that they can push the boundaries with him, and he's not just going to smite them and say,
Yep.
away
Yeah.
with you.
Well, he clearly isn't. He's a very charismatic character. And where he's always seemed to have some lurking, subterranean motive for everything he does, he's still likable. He's still got, I wouldn't say it's a conscience, but he thinks about things. And as you say, he didn't push himself on Janeway in any way. So he recognises there's limitations and he recognises there's boundaries, etc. So I think it's hard to dislike Q because he is like that. He's quite complex. He's not really flouting his omnipotence. And when he does, it's kind of humorous.
Yep.
Almost, yeah.
I also think that I would question whether or not it was a supernatural or omnipotent power that causes him to be likable, because if it is, then it's a really, really great one, because it happens to me as well. And there was a fascinating meme that came out from the recent Picard series where Q is involved, where in an exchange between Q and Picard, Q references several episodes of Star Trek. He talks about yesterday's Enterprise, and he talks about a mirror in a mirror darkly. And so the question is asked: does Q know that he's in a TV series, and breaks the fourth wall in a sense that likable charisma breaks the fourth wall, because not only do we find the characters forgiving him and liking him, but we are. I find myself, despite my better judgment, liking him and looking forward to seeing him in future episodes of Star Trek.
Well, I'm the same, Will. I respond, even though he can be a misogynistic twat at times. I do respond to his charisma, and I respond to his motives are usually not dreadful.
Yep.
It's not like he's trying to become ruler of the universe or do anything that classic villains do, you know. He's much more complex and nuanced than that, and I think that's part of his appeal.
Yep, absolutely. So if there's an omnipotent power, then that means that he's able to use it. The character can use it on us. Wow, that is powerful. A TV character can manipulate the audience watching.
He seems very genuine when they're lined up to be shot, and he apologizes to Janeway and says, "I'm sorry," and she says, "I know you are." And I think the interesting thing with Q is that, as you say, his motivation has over time generally proved to be positive, and some of the interactions, particularly with Picard in Next Generation, seem to indicate that he wants the best for humanity and wants the best for people that he likes, like Picard. And so he poses these interesting tests or whatever in order to see that they can actually overcome the problem. And I think that's, for me, what's so fascinating about the current series, Picard, is to see whether this still holds true and whether there is some positive sense of what Q's trying to do with Picard or not.
Well, it's a bit hard for me to comment on that because I haven't watched it.
Oh, maybe you should.
Maybe I should.
So just to go a little bit lighter, the holodeck. Neelix's holodeck scene comes back again.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, at least in the first one where they were a beach volleyball team, they were athletes.
That's me, sorry.
At least when they were a beach volleyball team, they were athletes. Now they're just sort of eye candy masseurs,
Oh, yes. This is the way to do crew review reports. Yes. Oh, well.
That's it.
Maybe my sermons might come out easier if I had, that situation behind me.
Oh, come on. It was a bit sexist, wasn't it? And a bit over the top sort of macho.
Well, it was, but then there was also a nice bit where it's Q in the foreground speaking, but in the background you see a fully uniformed female officer, wandering past with her beefcake boy in tow, carrying a drink for her or whatever.
Well, that's, I suppose, Star Trek's effort to balance things up.
Yeah,
But it still comes across as a boys' club.
Oh, it's a production of the 90s.
Yes, it is.
We don't see that kind of behaviour in current productions of Star Trek. So,
but I do have a deep desire next time I'm in a pub to go up to the server and say, "You bar rodent, another one of those fruity concoctions."
That was funny. That's why you like Q, because he comes out with this stuff. It's hard not to like that because it's a funny line, and even though it kind of Neelix gives him as good as he gets, you have to laugh at it, I think.
I think he tricks Neelix into giving him information. That's where he comes up with the plan to give Janeway a dog, which is going to be able to seduce her, and it kind of works. She's very keen.
She's got taken with the little dog.
Yep. Yes. Yep. A couple of other goofs I don't know if you noticed it, but in the final scenes where Tuvok and Harry and Chakotay are around the firelight after everything's over, they forgot to put Tuvok's ears on.
Did they?
Yeah, so it's worth going to have a look. Have a look at that one. Yes, Tuvok has become a human. Maybe that's part of the parable. Maybe he had to become a human to be a part of the American Civil War.
Maybe he did.
But I went, oh, hang on, I had to double take there. Go, wait a second. Very good. I didn't want to end this episode without giving a hat tip to the actress who plays Q.
Yeah.
Yep. Having appeared in multiple episodes of Star Trek in the past, she plays Kalair, who's the first wife of Worf and mother of Alexander. In 2 episodes, she also plays a Romulan ambassador in 1 episode, and in Enterprise she plays an Andorian. So she's had a number of different roles where she brings, I think, very well alien persona to the truly alien persona to the characters that she brings into Star Trek.
Well, she certainly did in this one. If most of the Q in their omnipotence are condescending prats, she did that remarkably well, I thought. And talking down to everybody, and the way she referred to everybody who was human or not human, well, not a Q actually. She did have that very obvious sneer, I thought.
Yes. What are you doing with that dog? And I'm not talking about the animal.
That's right.
Yes, or her equivalent of "Hey, you bar rodent" was "You helm boy."
Helm boy.
Yeah, that's right. So I thought there was some funny lines from her as well. So the Q are obviously. I didn't think the captain of the other side was particularly humorous or entertaining.
No.
Particularly when he's lining up to shoot everybody. And why they wanted to shoot Janeway rather than just banishing her back to her dimension and her humanity really did surprise me. What were you going to gain from doing that? That seemed to me something for an omnipotent being to be doing. Was particularly callous.
It's a bit petty, actually, I thought.
It was completely petty.
Beneath them, yes.
And that was a fine speech that Q got, and I gave at that point, and I thought that he meant it. So, we got to see a better side of him than what we'd been looking at for most of the episode.
So my final quote of the week was from Janeway, where she's arguing with Q about why she doesn't want to do things. And he says, maybe I could send you home. And her response is, "My crew and I will get home. We're committed to that. But we're going to do it through hard work and determination. We're not looking for a quick fix." And I went, what? Really? That's all that they're ever doing, stopping to look at every cosmic thing,
fix.
Yep,
that's exactly right.
But I'm guessing she was referring to the quick fix, like that even
snap of the fingers.
Yeah, so even if they had to scientifically research a wormhole, I mean, the reality is, and this is a major spoiler, the way they do get home is a quick fix, which violates the Prime Directive and messes with the time stream. So I'm kind of going, you serious? The way we end this entire series is by breaking all the rules we've followed for the entire series. So
getting home.
Yeah, but they get home, absolutely, yes.
Because
Oh, well, that will be interesting. I look forward to this.
Yes, yeah. Well, we got a lot of ground to cover before
Yes,
we
I've noticed.
before we get there. But we're doing
But
well.
I did think it was funny that there's something about Q's offer that she responds instinctively negatively to,
Yeah.
whereas if it had been the caretaker's partner that they went looking for, and the caretaker's partner had said, "Okay, I'll snap my fingers and send you back," they would have felt good about it.
They would have.
Why do they not like Q doing it for them?
I guess with the caretaker, he got them there. So expecting the caretaker or his mate to have some part in sending them back is not unreasonable, because that was the cause of the whole thing in the first place, where it's not the same with Q. And with Q, you always feel there's going to be strings attached. You just do.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Well, that's been another fascinating episode. Next week, we get to look at the episode called Macrocosm. And I'm fairly certain that Elizabeth, you might need to leave your credulity bone at the door for this one. We'll certainly get to explore maybe some conversations about COVID and how we deal with disease. So there'll be some interesting stuff to come up for that episode.
Oh, was there a plague?
Oh, yes, but unlike any plague you've ever seen before, I can assure you.
Really?
A fascinating delve into all of that. If you're interested in supporting us, please remember you can go to Patreon and Never Odd or Even Media and support us there. There's a number of good goodies there. And likewise, you can leave your comments and thoughts and questions for us at Facebook page Never Odd or Even, where we can explore that there. Just wanting to forecast also just before we go, I've watched the first episode of the Marvel series Moon Knight, which has just come out, and it deals with an area which is close to my family, a superhero with DID, dissociative identity disorder, and putting a team together to explore that. I've had it on good authority now from my son Praxis, who has dissociative identity disorder, and his psychologist, that they've actually gone to great length to try and make this an authentic presentation of DID, which often gets very poorly represented and sensationalized in TV shows and media. So stay tuned for that potential podcast series for Never Odd or Even on Moon Knight that will be coming up soon.
Sounds exciting.
It does.
I'll have to watch it.
That's right. Until next week, this has been VoyJourn, and I've been Will Nicholas.
I'm Lindsay Cullen.
And I'm Elizabeth Rain.